One day I just drove down Sunset Boulevard, and I saw a new restaurant had opened and had an outdoor patio. And I didn't recall any other restaurants having an outdoor patio. And I kind of liked the idea of eating outdoors. So I thought I would try it. And I recall one thing very specifically. At that time of my life, I was not a vegetarian. I ate everything. I liked to eat. And I went into this new restaurant, and I sat down outside on the patio. Probably had a book with me. I liked to dine alone in those days. And somebody came by with a menu, and I opened the menu in search of something familiar. And I thought, these must be the appetizers, because there were a lot of salads. And I asked one of the waitresses if there was anything more in the menu, and she explained it's a vegetarian restaurant. And I said, well, let me just try the most popular salad. Whatever most people are eating, I'd like to try that. And she brought me this bountiful basket that was filled with everything. And it tasted differently than any other salad I had ever experienced in my life. I would probably wind up dining at the Source 50, 100, 200 times after that, usually going for that particular salad, occasionally venturing into other meals, and one time I made the mistake of ordering the cheesecake dessert, which I became immediately addicted to. So I recall the food, now we're talking about 30, 35 years ago. I can recall the way the avocados tasted as we sit here tonight. And that cheesecake. Yes.
Can you maybe fill me in on just a couple more details that you might have recalled about the Source, the way it looked, the way the people who served the food looked or acted, and just the way it felt to be in the restaurant or outside of it?
Yes. I recall the architecture of the restaurant, and I recall the look of the people who worked there. Architecture was less important to me. It was an outdoor patio that was mainly comprised of bricks. What I recall as being just your basic bricks. It may have had a little iron fencing on top of it, not terribly high, but it would give you a view of sunset. There couldn't have been more than 10 tables outside, that's my recollection. There were umbrellas when the sun came out. And inside, it was somewhat dark, intimate, maybe an additional 10 tables. And I remember when you walked into the restaurant, I'm seeing this in my mind's eye, there was a table, a circular table on the immediate right when you walked through the door. And from time to time I would see an older man with a white beard and very long gray hair, seated at that table, frequently talking with other people, softly. I'd walk past him. I preferred not to dine inside. There was something about the food and the environment that put me on the patio. It wasn't more than a month after I had been there that I noticed something unusual about the people who were serving me. Because usually when I go to restaurants, and when I did in 1969, I would go, I would bring my book, I would order my food, I would keep to myself, I would read and not pay a great deal of attention to the experience beyond the taste of the food. But I did notice that all the people who worked there were wearing what I can only describe today as white robes. They were all in white, and they appeared to be robes. I think if we were in Egypt, they'd be called galabeas. The people who served me were primarily female. Just a few males, primarily women. And gone there, I believe, almost every day of my life from the first time I went in. I noticed something else. The women were all stunning. They were beautiful women. But they were beautiful in the context of what they exuded, their attention to detail, the way they moved, the way they spoke, the way they listened to the order, the suggestions that they made, the eye contact. And just think about all of your experiences in restaurants and how often you can recall 40 years later what the people who served your food looked like. They were young, delicate, very little small talk, gave you all the time in the world, didn't take the food away when you put your silverware down for a second to turn the page of the book. And their eyes were like crystals. There was a clarity about them. Their skin was almost there was something angelic about them. And I have to admit that as the days went by, it was an additional motive that attracted me back to the restaurant. Tangentially, I also noticed the carpentry, the way the doors were done, the woodwork inside was different than the way, if you call dial a door in Hollywood, to have a door put up. These doors appeared to be, I thought, handmade. I recall seeing stained glass. I recall seeing crystal. I recall seeing the women wearing, I'm not talking about Cartier jewelry, but pieces, stones, rocks, that highlighted them and their eyes. It was a sensorial experience.
Thank you. Do you recall what kind of people were surrounding you? What kind of other people came to the source? We've heard that a lot of rock musicians from the time came. Maybe some of the Laurel Canyon musicians, others.
The restaurant drew a very eclectic group of people. Many of them were, of course, the musicians that would just drive down from Laurel Canyon for their late lunch. These were not people who showed up for breakfast, although I never had a breakfast at the Source, so I wouldn't really know, but the day started at 4 in the afternoon. Still seems reasonable to me. So I recall musicians. I recall other people who looked a little bit like the people who were serving us. I'm conscious of these words like servers, waiters, waitresses. Now it tends to sound almost class-oriented. I definitely felt a family vibe, because after I had come there so many times, they knew my name and greeted me, sometimes had my salad ready, sometimes attempted to tempt me with that cheesecake dessert. There were business people as well. There were people who showed up in suits and ties. People who, there were hotels along Sunset Boulevard, and they liked the idea of going to an outdoor restaurant, an outdoor patio. So there was a blending. It was not what I would have described at the time as, quote, a hippie restaurant or a hippie gathering point. It's a real serious restaurant. But there was something going on there that, by today's definition, had a David Lynch vibe to it. There was something happening, but you did not know what it was. It was, of course, a spirit and a presence and a magic.
Great, yeah, and this sort of takes me to an interview that you did, that we reproduced in the Source CD. I think
Yes.
it was with maybe KPFK, or was it?
I believe that the radio interview that I did with Jim Baker, which is how I knew him and how I referred to him, was done on a radio station called KPPC in Pasadena.
And during that interview, you spoke about the Source being more than a restaurant. You said that it
Station called KPPC in Pasadena.
And during that interview, you spoke about the Source being more than a restaurant. You said that it was, I think, an energy center, a focal point for the community. Can you expand upon that?
There came a time, 10, 20, 30, 40 meals into the experience, a month or 2 or 3, where I stopped bringing a book with me. Because there was something going on in this restaurant. There was something happening there that went beyond the food. And I developed just a sense of camaraderie with the people who worked there. And we began to engage in just little, what I would call, mini conversations, just little chit-chats. But you know how sometimes somebody can say a line to you, repeat a phrase, offer a quote, and it can change your life. And I was sensitive to the fact that the people who were there, unlike other restaurants, seemed to have some kind of relationship with each other. These weren't people who just came and went. It almost looked like it could have been a family of people. And one day, and I can't recall specifically what the occasion was, when I walked into the restaurant, it could have been a night that it was raining, or when the weather had turned, and I dined inside and not on the patio, that the man with the gray beard and the long hair smiled at me and said, "Hello, Elliott. It's nice to see you." And he introduced himself to me. And we talked for a moment or two. And I can't tell you 40 years later what we talked about, but I do remember how he looked and his presence and his clarity, and the fact that he may have spoken to my brain, but I felt him in my heart. Sometimes after that, he and I may have had a conversation that lasted 5 or 10 minutes. And we discussed vegetarianism. And by then I had decided to try vegetarianism, since I started going to the Source, and remained a vegetarian for years afterwards as a result of the experience. And one day, in just these brief little conversations, I asked him about the subject, and he said, quote, "I don't believe in eating anything that runs from me." And I thought about that. It seemed right. Sometime after that, in conversation, I said, "Hey, look, I do a little radio show, in Pasadena that people listen to." And he says, "Oh, I'm very much aware of that radio show. I've heard a lot about that radio show." And I said, "Well, would you ever consider being a guest? Would you ever consider coming down to the station and allowing me to interview you? And we open the phones so listeners can call you and ask you questions." And he said that he would be pleased to. He's a very gallant man. There was something I don't want to say otherworldly about him, but it seemed like he came from a romantic age. There was a certain kind of dignity about his presence beyond the spiritual factor. He accepted the invitation. Shortly thereafter, he came to KPPC Radio. We sat, I believe we spoke for an hour and a half. Listeners called, asked him questions. He was a marvelous guest and a great speaker. And during the course of the interview, which I thought would be about vegetarianism, another door opened. And that door is one that I would only describe today as a spiritual door and a way of life door and a meditative door, a yoga door, family door. And I guess it took me long enough, but I figured out that there was something going on at the Source that was a lot larger than those cheesecake desserts. With Jim on the radio, my subsequent visits to the restaurant became more compelling. I would go on to be a reporter for Eyewitness News, which is the ABC television station in Los Angeles. You probably have an Eyewitness News station wherever you are. And I asked one day if I could do a little profile piece on the Source. And Jim said, of course you could. And I went up there with a camera crew, but this time it was different. For the very first time, we left the restaurant, went up the hill. I recall only 2 or 3 or 4 blocks up the hill off of Sunset, to what was a gorgeous home with these beautiful grounds. And I remember swings and things that people could hang from outside. And there may have been a stream or a pool, some kind of water. And I realized that the faces that I had seen in the restaurant were the faces that I had seen in the home, and that the people in the restaurant were living together communally in this home. And I brought the Eyewitness News crew up with a couple of cameras, I guess, and who bought the food. It's referred to in the news business as B-roll, where you just shoot video without sound of people doing various things, and then you sit down for the interview. And I recall interviewing a few of the people and then sitting with Jim around this marvelous table that had a great assortment of food for us to all try. And Jim did an interview with me and then walked up a hill and into a tent by himself, what I would describe as a tent, more like a teepee. I think the sun was setting, and I aired the piece on Eyewitness News.
We believe in being harmless and happy and free.
And I remember dozens of people talking to me, coming up to me and telling me about how much they enjoyed the experience. Only part of it that I regretted was a day or two later when I went to the Source. I had to wait to get in because there were all these people who were now online, standing online is what I mean, to get in and get a seat. It had become extremely popular. I think years later, Woody Allen would make a movie and place himself in the Source, and I remember after that, more crowds came. I didn't like that. I remember it the old way, when it was a little bit more quiet.
Did you ever go to the Old World or the Aware Inn? Did you?
Yes.
And did you ever connect Jim Baker with those restaurants?
No.
Oh, no?
No.
He started both of those restaurants.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
I went to the Old World at the end of Sunset Boulevard across the street from Tower Records. Had the veggie burger there a number of times. Remember that. I went to the Aware Inn, of course. But it's not until this very moment that I associated Jim with those two restaurants. They were lovely restaurants, but they weren't the Source.
Fantastic. So, would you say that you were present and aware of the sort of changes that Jim Baker went through when he became father, and then Father Yod and Yehovah?
No. I knew Jim Baker as Jim Baker, which, I might add, was enough. When some of the people who were part of the Brotherhood of the Source spoke to me during my lunch visits about Jim and referred to him as Father and Yod and one or two other terms, and the words came off of their lips quite naturally and, if you pardon the pun, organically. I didn't have that connection. Although I had a tremendous reverence at the time, in '69, for my early spiritual, personal explorations, I didn't know about that component until I got to know one of the women at the restaurant a little better. And she told me some remarkable things about him. And I recall distinctly my last conversation with him, of which there were only 3 or 4. There was just the hellos, the KPPC radio interview, the Eyewitness News interview, the hello goodbyes as I was going in and out. And one day, towards the end of the source, I walked past that circular table, and I had a book in my hand. I can't remember what it was. If I were a betting man, and I am, I believe it was Kierkegaard. And as I was walking past the table, Jim said, "Hi, Elliott, how are you?" And I said, "Great, Jim, how are you?" He said, "What are you reading?" And I said, "Oh, it's existential philosophy." And he said, "Let me see that." And he looked at the book. But he just looked at the book. He didn't, read the back flap or flip through it. He just looked at the book as an object. And he said, "Is it helpful?" And I said, "Well, I'm only halfway through, but there are things in it that seem to be touching me." And he asked, "What?" And I couldn't quite express it at that point, And he said, "If you're ever interested, I have some books for you that you may enjoy as well." And I thanked him for that and said that I would welcome it. And he said to me, "You always call me Jim, don't you?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Do you know other people call me other things, don't you?" And I said, "I'm aware of that too." And he just looked at me. I don't recall a handshake. I certainly don't recall a goodbye. Just an exchange, eye to eye. I felt nothing but love in my heart for him. Then, and 40 years later as we sit here tonight, now, he was a very, very unique, high being to me. I don't recall a handshake. I certainly don't recall a goodbye. Just an exchange, eye to eye. I felt nothing but love in my heart for him. Then, and 40 years later as we sit here tonight, now, he was a very, very unique, high being and connected with people on a level that few do. And upon reflection, probably nourished me more than Kierkegaard that were part of my life, right? So that's my responsibility is to mirror these beings with as much accuracy as I can and not embellish and try to pass it along. I wish I could do it with a guitar and a harmonica. It would be more entertaining, I think, but
just depends on the viewer. Some don't want the guitar and the harmonica.
Some don't want the. I'm told on the internet they all want the guitar and the harmonica. It's not true.
It's a big internet.
It's a big internet. I like that phrase.
So Elliott, when you talk about this, if you could, if it's possible, maybe just take a moment to contextualize that period just a bit in those terms as far as that consciousness that time period and what was happening along those lines, maybe how it resonated with you, why you interviewed these people.
For those people who weren't around in the 1960s, this was one of the most extraordinary periods of time during the 100 years that preceded it. There was more innovation, alteration, revolution, and passion during that period, certainly than any time that I've been alive, including now. And I couldn't imagine my parents or grandparents having it much more intriguing than it was for all of us now who are a little further along on the trail. I don't doubt that people had interesting experiences in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s and even today. Now we're first waddling into the 21st century. But the 1960s was so dramatic and filled with such passion that it created the 50 or 60 million people who now walk among us in the United States. You could link into a variety of subjects on the menu, from the music to the fashion to the politics to the... You can go down the chart. But uppermost on the chart for me, in terms of recollection, was the spiritual awakening. In the midst of turmoil, and keep in mind there were things going on that were extraordinarily difficult to cope with. Things like the Vietnam War, the assassination of President Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, and some of the madness of the time, and some of the dangers of the times. There was this ocean, this bed of spiritual support that people felt from each other who were in the moment, that came through the music, the culture, the literature, the experimental communes, places like the Source, people like Jim. I was on the radio and television in LA, I think, for 6 or 7 years. I interviewed more than 2,000 guests. I took probably 15 or 20,000 phone calls on the air. I lived an electric media life. It was given for me to do. That time around, I was the mouth and others were the ears. My role was to provide a conduit where people coming to LA could find themselves in front of a microphone and speak to others. In the early days of radio, I probably spent a lot of my time just interviewing musicians and sometimes actors and actresses. I mean, fine actors and actresses, and then Jack Nicholson and Dennis Hopper and, you know, all the people of the culture at the time. As the winds of changes shifted, I found that my audience, and me, wanted to also hear from Krishnamurti, Bhagwan Das, Baba Ram Das, Alan Watts, Allen Ginsberg, Paramahansa Yogananda, Maharishi Mahesh Yoga, and dozens more that I could name. So, I made it my business to make contact with folks like that. Hard to say folks like that. How many folks do you know who are like that in your neighborhood? But suddenly, I would come to work at the radio station. I would sit down, the door would open, and there would be Ram Dass, who would be seated next to me and who would speak for 3 or 4 hours and take phone calls from listeners. And Alan Watts would come by 3, 4, 5 times and talk to me. And Allen Ginsberg came by and he brought his father and they read poems to me and the listeners. And those people who could not come by because they were in India or wherever they were, I played recordings of them, lectures, so the word would go out. I recall an evening, for heaven's sake, on KABC radio where David Menangi showed up. He was the spiritual leader of the Hopi Indian tribe. He was in his 80s and blind. And he sat down in that room. I turned all the lights off, lit incense and candles. It was a radio show, but it was more like church. It was a blessing. I mean, I was gifted to have been in that seat, in the presence of these beings, and sharing what they had to say with thousands who wished to or needed to hear the message. It was a rare and unique privilege. It was a learning experience for me and a transformation experience. I recall those names with greater ease than if you asked me to tell you the names of the people who had sold 1 million records. With all due respect to the people who sold 1 million records. That evening with David Menangi, as we tape this interview in 2009, November, I'm 3 months away from my 65th birthday. So these recollections go back more than half a lifetime. Those voices, those sounds, and that direction resounds as clearly as it did then. And will forever, as it always has.
Do you ever find yourself longing for those kind of moments again, or do you experience them now in different ways, or?
I never long for the spiritual moments because they never left me. I feel a greater sense and allegiance to the dictates of Spirit, God, in my heart today than I did 40 years ago. 40 years ago, I did these interviews and still entertain dreams of maybe other career plans and going on to bigger television stations, where I could present these people on a wider stage, and was preoccupied with all the other distractions of boys in their 30s coming of age in California in the 60s and 70s. If you got it, if you truly got the message that was being given to you again, as it has been given to you for the past 50, 500, 5,000, 10,000 years, if you were in touch with your heart and soul at that time, and you continued to do your homework, if you continued your meditation, if you continued your spiritual due diligence, you're just a shot away. If you feel yourself drifting just a little bit, you know how to get back on the path again. It's not like any of this stuff played for a month and then it was time to move on to the next parade. It may have been that way for others. I run into people all the time who are living their lives close to spirit, close to the magic. And in fact, as they get older, revisiting these subjects with greater clarity. One of the things that's happening right now among what we'll call the Woodstock generation are all the children who are now turning in their 60s. They're dealing with the issues of dying parents. Well, when you turn 60 and your parents are turning 80 or 90, and you were with them for their transition, you return to the beginning through their eyes. The way they saw you when you first arrived might be the way you now have to remember them as they're moving on to their next level. Some can handle that with dignity and grace. For others, enormous pain. It's one of the great issues of the 21st century. It's one of the things that we're going to have to deal with, and deal with grace. And during the time that we're currently living in, where there are a lot of hard edges, and a lot of people hurting, and a lot of unemployment, a lot of sadness, and war, and terrorism, and bombs, and people losing their ability to communicate with each other this way because they're doing it on the internet or through MySpace, where relationships that should have lasted a lifetime seem more fleeting than they ever have before. Well, who are you going to call upon? You are going to call upon the God within, as we always have through the beginning of time. And however people choose to do that, that's their own choices and their own paths. I honor all of them, of course. But a life lived today without the presence of God, Spirit, it would have to get really lonely out there. You got it.
Fantastic. Thank you.